Alright, so this is going to be a long ramble, probably about economics and why I think the US economy in particular, though we could get into China's economy and its struggles and other economies, though I know less about those, but the US economy, I believe, is something like 30% of the global economy. So it matters a lot what happens in the US. Obviously, for Americans like me, but for the rest of the world as well. And, there's a lot of things happening right now that are pretty commonly talked about. Uh, People talking about the jobs numbers and inflation. But I think there's a lot happening that isn't really being talked about that much, at least in the context of the economy. And when you bring it all together, I think it paints a much worse picture than if you just look at the market. This grapefruit is pretty dry. But if you just look at the market, you'd think everything's going great. I think a lot of this has not been priced in. If I had the balls, or if I was just more of a gambler, I would probably short the market. But I'm neither of those. I have neither of those. So, and I also don't know when exactly. I mean, this is the thing. Like, I was having a Reddit conversation today, which obviously you never really want to do that, but basically the guy was saying, I was saying, I think some point soon the US will go into a recession. And he pointed out, well, that's not that helpful, because what does that mean? I mean, and he's right. But so I would say within the next 12 months, so the next year. I mean, the hard part is, how do you even define a recession? If it's when you have 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, or is it, like, I could make the argument that technically we might already be in a, not technically, but we could already be in a recession if we look back at it. Like, when you go back to 2008, at what point would you declare it a recession? Is it after 2 quarters of negative GDP, or is it, when Lehman Brothers goes under, Bear Stearns, at what point is it? So that's constantly debated, but I do think things are deteriorating pretty rapidly, though a lot of people have convinced themselves that it's not going to be that bad. I'd say the biggest factor in my thesis for why things are bad is just the tariffs, which is talked about a lot for good reason. I think if you look at the history of tariffs, they're pretty much always bad, with perhaps the exception of very narrow tariffs, like to protect a certain, typically when the countries are developing, they're used, so you just don't get crushed by the bigger players before you even have a chance to compete. But when you're talking about mature industries, I think it typically, not only does it hurt both countries, but I think in the long run, I would make the case that it actually hurts the country more that is the ones starting with tariffs. And one of the reasons for that is that it increases the price of imports. So cars are a classic example these days of like how many parts go across borders, some several times. So it's really, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. Or if you put something like a tariff on steel, everybody that uses that steel now is less competitive than those other countries that aren't paying a tariff on steel. But I think that's that's not really the worst part. The worst part is that you become uncompetitive over time, because when you protect industries from competition, it's really hard to go back and make them globally competitive. Again, unless it's maybe like a really targeted case, or you're trying to grow a specific industry, like you could make that argument for the semiconductor industry in the US that is pretty much gone these days. Or is at least much less than I think it used to be. I'd have to check those numbers. I think that's right. And it's certainly getting outcompeted. So there's maybe some cases for it. I think you have to be really careful. But what I've been surprised by is when you look at these tariff deals, every time there's a deal, the market seems to breathe a sigh of relief, and for good reason. Like, we've averted the worst, absolute worst case scenarios, which is like an endless trade, like increasing trade war, where like you basically get to be like a trade embargo, which happened with China for a little bit, where you go up to 150 whatever percent tariffs, and to that point you can't even really trade. So we've avoided the absolute worst scenario, but at what cost? And so it's seen as a win when you get a 15% across the board tariff on the EU or several other countries, Japan, or in some cases higher. I believe for Canada and Mexico, at least some goods are higher. And for China, I believe the effective tariff rate is over 30% on all goods. And I could be wrong on that, but definitely the overall rate in China is higher than 15%. And some of that was priced in because there were already some tariffs on China. But these are huge escalations. And so you think, well, only 15%, or like in the best case, 10% on the UK. It's like, 10, 15%. It's not that bad. And when you look at that, when you look at the that finishes half of the grapefruit. But what was I saying? Nothing smart, probably. Yeah, so you think 18% effective tariff rate, now that could go up or down. I think it'll actually probably be somewhat stable here for a little while. It seems like the general idea of the Trump administration is to get something close to 15% tariff on most countries. That seems to be where it settles. And so I think the effective tariff rate before was like 2% or something, and so that I don't know if they're adding the 15% on. I think that's what they're doing. I could be wrong again, but anyway, that's the numbers I've heard. So whether it's 18% or 20% or 15%, those little percentages matter. But the overall picture is like if you're basically tariffing the whole world at 15% and China, that's a huge deal. I mean, I would predict probably a recession just on that. Yeah, again, this is assuming that the courts don't strike it down, which could happen, or if Congress does something, which seems much less likely. But assuming that this general regime happens, and by the way, I think if the courts did try to strike it down, he might just ignore it and do it anyway. I'd say that's quite likely. Uh, so in this case, yeah, I think 15%, 18% effective tear rate is massive. Like that is going to probably create very high levels of inflation. Or if it doesn't, because sometimes tariffs can be a little bit deflationary, basically if demand drops, that's also a really bad outcome. Like there's no good outcome here. Uh, on the margins, there's some benefits, but overall, it's a disastrous policy. I think we're going to have to learn the hard way once again that tariffs, at least broad based tariffs, don't work and hurt you ultimately more than hurt other people, especially in the long run. So, in the short run, maybe China gets hurt worse, maybe other countries get hurt worse. They'll start trading with each other, though. They'll find ways to do it, and it's a good way to lose allies as well. but just if you focus just purely on the United States, I do think you see a really bad negative effect. Now, people say, well, economists have been predicting this for a long time, and well, we're not seeing that much inflation. I would say this is where we get to one of the problems that we often have when talking about economics, is because it's similar to inflation in 2021, 2022. Uh, you know, economists say it's transitory. Everybody makes fun of them. It says, it's not transitory at all. It's like a serious inflation event. And they are true. The critics are right that a lot of economists underestimated the level of inflation there would be. But also all the people that expected there to be a recession, or that you're going to need something like the Volcker era interest rate increases to tame inflation, which again caused a recession, they, I think, also weren't right. That yes, we did have to increase interest rates relatively high, nowhere near Volcker levels, but we did have a soft landing, and I think that's because ultimately inflation was transitory. It just transitory doesn't mean it's going to be gone in 2 months or 6 months, but it wasn't like one of those sticky inflation events. So I think the people that compared it to inflation after World War II, which I don't know much about that, but I believe it was 1948 that there was some inflation due to shipping and other problems, but it went away. I do think that argument ended up being right. It was just that transitory meant, two-ish years, not like 2 months or 6 months or even a year. Now you could say, well, that's not really transitory or whatever, but I do think it's a very different type of inflation that we saw in like the 1970s, which wasn't due to a black swan event that interrupted things so badly and threw demand and supply out of whack. It so in the 70s was like actual inflation that was driven by like an input, like oil prices in that case, and other inflation events. I think are similar. So I would separate those two events, and I think we also have this problem. You can see it when there's basically what I'm talking about is when there's lags. So people are really quick to say economists or whoever were wrong about things, but I think you have to wait and see. And it'd be great if we could figure out if we could have better predictions. I mean that it is, and it is important to say if people are constantly predicting the wrong thing, but the difficulty with lag, which you see also in inflation data, is like, and this is a great example, I think, of uh, initially inflation was probably undercounting because it wasn't including the increases in rent and housing costs, because there's like a 12-month delay on that, from my understanding, in the CPI or the core or whatever includes housing, uh, because people aren't getting new housing every month, so it's not going to show up, and so you have like a 12-ish month lag on that, and then the reverse happened where inflation data arguably was overestimated after the spike, uh, in the indices that included housing, which diverged from the other indices like energy, or consumer goods, because housing is like a lagging indicator. And so that's a tangent there, but the basic idea is like, and how I connect it to the present day is you have lagging indicators. So if you increase tariffs massively in April, and then they bounce around a little bit, but they ultimately go down, it is a win in some sense that you've avoided the worst case scenario, like I said, but you have this massive increase in tariffs, historic, I believe the biggest since the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which were, I think, universally considered a terrible idea. And so I do think we'll see not Great Depression levels of bad, but it's going to be bad, and I think it's going to be a rough road out of it. Again, if something doesn't happen that changes things very quickly, and I think even then you'd see some damage. Even if they were overturned today, there would be some damage, but obviously it would be much less than otherwise, and you could maybe avoid a recession, but I don't see that happening. Uh, and so that's the biggest piece of it is tariffs on the U.S. economy. Uh, the other piece of it, I think there's several pieces of it, but another piece that is talked about, but I think not enough, is immigration. And whether you like or dislike immigration, I think it's extremely clear that it is good for the overall economy, uh, both high skilled and low skilled. Now, a lot of people maybe get upset by that. I think when you look at the data, though, uh, there are definitely serious harms, but the overall picture is that it improves the economy. It's kind of an obvious finding, I think, if you increase the pool of people. I mean, that's why China has close to as big of an economy as the US, just because there's so many more people. I mean, like, so what's happening now is if you deport hundreds of thousands, probably they may be able to deport millions of people by the end of this. But even if you don't, are not able to deport most of the people here legally, some, I think 11 million is an estimate that gets thrown around, you make people much more fearful, less likely to go into work when you do, especially these kinds of raids they're doing. Uh, and again, you can say that that's a great policy that you agree with, but I do think the effect on the economy will be very high, and it will be maybe even more immediate than the tariffs. I think you might already be seeing it in the increase in grocery prices in the PPI, so the producer price index, which is how much producers are paying, which they eventually will pass on to consumers. I don't know, this is where I should look, but I think it went up something like 38% for, and I don't know if it was like just vegetables or produce or all of it, but a massive increase. It may be an outlier, but I do think immigration has a serious effect on that, pretty obviously. And same thing, beef prices are up. That's and anywhere where illegal immigrants commonly work, but it's not just that; it's also legal immigration, and student visas getting revoked, and also the fear that creates. So even if only a few dozen, a few hundred student visas and everything gets revoked, I do think that has an economic impact. Now, I think that one is more of a long-term economic impact that you won't see nearly as quickly as cracking down on illegal immigration. Also because I think the numbers are lower. I would also like to look at the numbers of for legal immigration. We know that illegal immigration has fallen to near zero. Well, I shouldn't say that. We know at the border it has. I don't know about people overstaying their visas and stuff like that, which historically has been a lot of illegal immigration comes from that. But I think that'll be more of a long-term effect of being a drag on the U.S. economy, of the legal immigration and visa issues and stuff like that. That brings me to another point that I think is also relatively rarely talked about is tourism and a backlash against the U.S. economically. And by this I mean backlash in Canada. You're having boycotts there. You're having tourism boycotts. We've already seen that affect businesses. We've seen it, I think, affect Florida, and Las Vegas, other places that Canadians commonly go to. It's a very big market. I think when you look at the numbers of Canadian trade in general with the U.S. are very high numbers, and it's not going to be like a full boycott. There's people still going to be buying some American goods, but it's especially the ones they target, like liquor. You're seeing large effects. In some cases, Canada is the number one buyer, I think, even compared to the U.S. population. Again, I could be wrong on that, but I think in liquor sales, some of these brands sell more to Canada than they do to the U.S. I could be completely wrong, but either way, we know it is a large segment. And let's say it's only 10% of sales to Canada. I think that's pretty difficult to replace. And if you're one of these big companies, your margins are probably, I don't know, maybe 5%. I would say maybe less than that for some of these big liquor companies that sell cheap beer and stuff like that. Though those prices have been going up too. So maybe they've cushioned themselves or they have extra profits, but I really don't think their margins are that high. And so even if you lose 10% of your market, which I think in many of these cases it's much higher than that, that's really bad. That really puts a drag on you. And maybe the boycotts will fizzle out, who knows, but I think as damaging as that, or maybe not yet as damaging, but I do think people will just be less likely to visit the U.S. And I was also shocked when I looked this up how big tourism is to the U.S. economy. I think it's in the single digits, but I think it's in the high single digits. Again, I wish I had these numbers off the top of my head. I think it's like, I thought it was 8% or something of the U.S. economy, which seems incredibly high considering how big the U.S. economy is, but it's big. And a lot of that, is internal tourism. That's probably the main part of it. But Um, Europeans are going to be much less likely to come to the U.S. when you hear these horror stories of people getting detained, and uh, there's stories of like a young woman from England being detained. German, it's like not even in a way it's almost good. I mean, they're going after everybody. They're not really biased against only Muslim countries or whatever it is. It's like, which maybe you should be. I mean, you probably should be a little biased towards them, of like if it's a greater threat, but they are pretty indiscriminate. Um, and I do think that has knock-on effects that we're seeing, but I think we'll see a lot more of, as if especially if these stories continue. If it dies down again, maybe the effect is somewhat temporary, but um, and that leads you also into the loss of soft power. I think this one's a really long-term thing. I think it'll be hard to see even probably in the next by the end of the Trump administration. I don't know if you'll see that much from it, but I do think a long-term slide in soft power, and specifically like things like media. Now this one's more speculative. It might not happen, but I do think like when you again basically declare a form of economic war against these countries. Now, some like China have been cheating or whatever, but countries like Canada, I think the arguments there are really terrible. Um, you could try to steelman the arguments of like why we're tariffing Canada. About the fentanyl thing just makes zero sense. There's no evidence that I've been able to find about that. The milk thing, that's a fair argument. They do have some. It's close to quotas, and you can say, well, we've never even hit the quota, but I think we've never hit the quota because the tariff's like 400% after that or something crazy. So obviously the quota's never been hit. So is there some things on the margin? Yeah, but like going after them in that way isn't what you do if you're trying to negotiate over like a milk tariff. I would say it's quite the thing to do full on tariffs for because you're upset about a dairy tariff. So and Mexico again, you can say drugs or whatever, but and it's really just the whole world. And I think it goes to their theory. They make all these excuses now. It's India and it's Switzerland. Like you can't have good reasons for all these countries. I just don't think they exist. So it's actually, I think, even worse than that. It's an economic theory that they think that they'll raise money from tariffs, which will be raised from American consumers as a consumption tax. I was listening to a recent recent podcast by Moody's, and talking about how when you look at the index that tracks what importers are paying, basically there's been little change, which means that they're passing those tariffs on to the American company that's importing it. You'd expect to see, I think, that to go down if they were eating, that index to go down if the foreign countries were eating some of the tariff, but that doesn't seem to be happening yet. And again, a lot of these margins are just really small. So if you slap down a 1, 2, 3% tariff, that could be fine. When you get to 10, 15, 20%, that's a disaster. And some of these countries, and then there's also the uncertainty as well. And some of these countries, then you have Switzerland currently at 39% for some random reason. India is now high. It'll probably come back down to about 15%, but these are massive, massive deals. So we've talked about tariffs, immigration, soft power, tourism, and both types of immigration. And to me, it really just seems like a perfect storm for the U.S. economy. Also, trade relations deteriorating with China is not good. Maybe it's good for national security. It's definitely not good for the economy, at least in the short run. Um, and you're taking a huge gamble. You're taking a huge gamble in several dimensions. One dimension is that you're hoping that your allies kind of go along with you, especially in the long run, and they don't find different trading partners. Now, when you are 30% of the global economy, it is difficult, but people eventually will adapt. And if these tariffs stay on for, uh, I'd say, any significant number of years, um, that will start changing. It also, pushes more people to actually trade with China, which is kind of the opposite of what you'd assume they want from a foreign policy, national security point of view. China has its own problems that I think she is doing a pretty bad job currently. So that's really the saving grace. He's not doing nearly as bad of a job as Trump, but uh, regardless, he's doing some economically illiterate things as well, which is sort of an average authoritarian move. It seems like, as a side note, how almost none of the authoritarians are doing a good job economically. I mean, you look at Erdogan, is that his name? In Turkey, you look at, who else? A lot of the Middle Eastern countries. You can say Saudi Arabia is maybe one of the best ones economically, that they're really trying to make some big investments. I'd say overall, Putin obviously is I mean, they're already doing terribly economically, and this is just disastrous for them. Almost a suicidal, I mean, literally suicidal in terms of killing their young men and old men at this point, just conscripting anybody. But economically as well, just seems like near a suicide mission. Interest rates at what, near 20%, and just terrible for the economy, even with war production notwithstanding. I mean, it looks bleak over there. At best, they can hope that oil prices like shoot up again. Um, but yeah, getting off track now. But that is my general thesis: is that I don't know if I'm missing anything on the U.S. economy, but I do think this is like one or two of these things. I think tariffs by itself is so bad that it by itself would probably cause a recession. But especially when you add in immigration and really the brutal way they're enforcing it, it's not like a slow and steady. It's really all at once, and the efforts are only ramping up. And legal immigration getting restricted. Or you can also look at, I don't know if I would say that's a drag on the economy yet. But it will be a drag on the economy for sure, long term, is cutting, cutting, not so cutting the government could be good for the economy if you did it in a smart way. But so first of all, just cutting jobs and cutting spending. Now, not quite, didn't cut that much, and overall the deficit seems to be stable or increasing, largely because of the big beautiful bill and its tax cuts. But I think overall still probably a little bit less spending than otherwise would be. But that's an immediate, pretty immediate effect when people lose jobs, and the ripple effect. And so and it may well be a good policy. I don't think so the way they did it, but either way, the short-term impact is bad economically, so you stack that on. But even more importantly, long-term, you stack um, the cuts to basic research that most companies don't do much of because it's not very profitable, but them canceling a lot of grants, budgets for things that really do massively help the economy. And you can go look at a list of really important current consumer technologies and all sorts of things that came from early government spending. You can even look at the internet coming from DARPA, I believe, and military spending. Now, I think maybe that's mostly the one thing that's escaped is sort of the military side of things in general. But yeah, the cuts to scientific research is, I think, going to be a massive long term drain on the economy. So I wouldn't really think that has any impact on a near term recession. But long term, this will be terrible. And if you combine that with uh, intimidating foreign students and universities in general, taking away university funding, now that could have more of a short term impact, perhaps. But anyway, the conclusion that I have is that I would be shocked if there's not a recession. Now, I'm not going to try to predict an exact quarter or anything like that. I'd be surprised if we don't fall into one within the next year. And it's looking bleak. And the unfortunate thing is, I think the long term looks, if anything, maybe more bleak. But hopefully, some of these things can be changed either sooner or the next administration, or I mean, hopefully this administration realizes what they're doing. I'm somewhat doubtful of that. You're seeing the weakness of sort of authoritarian systems in general, where if there's nobody to tell you that you're wrong, kind of like the first Trump administration, where there was enough people doing that, then you do all of these economically illiterate things. And yeah, I think it's going to be really bad. So if I was gonna, I think the bull case to me basically runs in one direction. And what I mean by that is I think basically the case that the US economy survives a recession, I think that's really difficult even in the bull case, but let's say the bull case happens and it's much even better than the best projections. Is really, I think it runs through AI. You look at the crazy numbers of capital spend, which is a short term boost to the economy. You see some productivity gains already happening, and if that is able to grow fast enough, and I think I'm continually impressed by AI. I mean, ChatGPT 5, not the best rollout and whatever. I still think, and not like the most insane thing, but I still think it is a very big upgrade from 4 or 4.5. I don't know what we were on. It gives you some pretty incredible results, especially with the long thinking mode. But yeah, I think it basically all runs through that. It sort of, I almost think the U.S. economy is sort of like a mini version of Tesla at this point, where the core of it, the core economy, the core business in Tesla's case is struggling a lot. I think the car business, but I'd say most of the stock price in both Tesla and the U.S. Is being propped up by humanoid robots and robo-taxis in Tesla's case, and AI in general in the US's case. And that really could be such a powerful economic force that it overrides a lot of these negative real drains on growth. And AI is crazy. I mean, who can predict what's going to happen? But like, I'd say if the variance is like in the top 10% of best case scenarios, you're like 2 or 3 standard deviations from the mean, especially like 3 standard deviations, you could probably just outgrow almost anything in like the case where AGI is somewhere around the corner in the next few years. Even the lead up to that would probably be pretty insane economically. even with displacements. And I still don't know if that could outrun tariffs. I do think tariffs are just uniquely economic poison. I would like to be, again, like with all these things, like I don't really like the doom and gloom is terrible. Uh, but I this is how I see it. But I would love to be wrong. I mean, it'd be much better to say, well, I'd much rather be positive and optimistic right now and say, well, the market's right. Like this stuff's gonna happen. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's not the main. It's sort of a sideshow, and Trump does his thing and whatever. I think this time around, people are way underestimating the negative headwinds that we have, and yeah, I think it's gonna be a pretty bumpy road. That's why I do think I'm considering for the first time. I mean, I'm young, so I think most people, older people, more experienced people knew this, but I do think gold or euros or francs or even crypto. Uh, I say even crypto because I'm biased against crypto. I mean, crypto's been like the best performing asset in the past over a decade. So anything is probably better. Now I don't know how currency affects. I think it could go different ways. And that's one thing I didn't touch on too. I mean, I think the Fed is in a horrible position. It must be tragic to be Jerome Powell or anybody at the Fed at this point. You stick the soft landing about as best as anybody could have, and along comes these rogue tariffs and just threaten to absolutely rip everything up. Um, it's like a nightmare scenario for them. I think when you have likely highly inflationary effects, which you'd want to typically raise interest rates or at least keep it the same, and otherwise you have a deteriorating labor market and economy as a whole, and you'd want to reduce interest rates. And I don't know if they can really do either at this point. I think people are also way too optimistic about rate cuts. I think if push comes to shove, the Fed isn't going to want to repeat being a little bit slow like they were with the tariffs post COVID crash. And if anything, they might be a little bit more hawkish. Now, who knows with what Trump may do, but I'd say, and if they do reduce rates, I think it will come back to bite them. Now, if they reduce it, a quarter point, half point, I still think that might be a bad idea, but, the interest rates may be high enough to offset the worst of the inflation. But I do think if they try to cut, like, I don't know what Besson said, it should be 150 points lower, 200 points lower. I think that would lead to brutal inflation. Again, unless, assuming the tariffs are not deflationary, in which case that's probably actually the nightmare scenario. If demand collapses that much that they're deflationary, that would be incredible, and that would be getting closer, I think, to like a great recession type scenario. But yeah, I rambled on here forever, but that is my general take on the economy and the future of the U.S. economy. I think I'd like to get into like China and other like the EU and what other countries are doing. But for right now, we'll leave it at that. Again, I'd love to be wrong. Absolutely would love to be wrong. Makes me very nervous as a holder of U.S. assets and even dollars at this point, which I didn't think I would say, but yeah, there you have it.